which is to help protect the innocent black folk in poor areas. And there's a man out there, Reverend Tim, begging, absolutely begging for law enforcement to come in and do the jobs that they're trained and hired to do better than anybody else can do it. And they're hand-tied, they're hog-tied, they're not allowing them to do it. That's racist. Thanks for stopping by Minnesota Black Robe Regiment. Make sure you're subscribed and that you're checking out the bell icon so you get notifications when my content drops. As always, like, comment, and share. That's all I ask. So, what are we going to be talking about today? Well, hopefully you've been paying attention if you're in Minnesota, and hopefully you've been paying attention if you're not in Minnesota. And why is it important that you're paying attention? Well, because Minnesota's crime rate is on the rise. And it's not just on the rise in the respect that small crimes are happening more. You know, people will argue back and forth that, overall crime is down. Some will say crime has stagnated. But in reality, Minnesota's crime rate is climbing exponentially. And it's truly troubling if you really understand what's going on. So last year in 2020, Tyrant Timmy of the People's State of Marxisota decided that he was going to shut down the state of Minnesota in March, all for precautions against a virus that has a better than 99.9% survival rate. That's been borne out. He put massive restrictions in place, and he made things criminal that shouldn't have been criminal. He criminalized small business. If you chose to open against his restrictions, against his tyrannical rule, you face criminal charges. If you violated his social distancing guidelines, if his stay-at-home order, you could be criminalized. Now, admittedly, there wasn't a lot of enforcement done in this. It was done more on a honor system, but a lot of it was also put on local businesses to go out and become the enforcement arm for the state. So the businesses were put under pressure to comply with the governor. Now, you guys are probably hearing this going, okay, TC, what's the big deal? Why are we still talking about this? Why are you focusing on this story when the governor has lifted the restrictions? Well, first of all, technically he hasn't really lifted the restrictions because he has reserved for himself and has re-extended his emergency powers for the coup. Now, here in the future, we're going to be having the man who authored that bill several years ago on the program to talk about his justification and his reasoning for it. And I want to give credit where credit is due and say the man is a conservative. We've had a phenomenal conversation over the phone. I think it's going to be informative for us to have this conversation for everybody. But it's also going to probably be a little bit of a tete-a-tete because I stand starkly opposed to the legislation that was passed that codified the ability of the governor to have legislative powers and the ability of the legislature to have executive veto powers. I stand starkly opposed to that. I think it violates the separation of powers that we see enshrined in the Minnesota Constitution and the United States Constitution. But all that aside, the governor has not given up those powers. He's extended those powers for himself. He has his hands on the dials, and at any time he can adjust them as he sees fit. So what have we seen then? We've seen the governor criminalize certain behaviors that up until 2020 were normative, everyday cultural behaviors that there's no reason for them to be criminal. We have seen people like Lisa Hansen made a criminal. We've seen people like Larvita McFarquhar made a criminal. We have seen people like Jane Moss in Grand Forks criminalized for her, East Grand Forks, for her desire to keep her business open. We've seen Bruce and the poorhouse over in Freeborn County threatened with criminal sanctions for keeping the business open. We have seen other businesses threatened. Lisa Hansen has been jailed. I mean, granted, briefly. Lisa Monet Zarza has lost one of her 2 businesses, and her other is under attack still. And that is the case over and over and over again. Criminalize, 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 criminalize. Threaten people with criminal fines for meeting in their own homes. Churches threatened with criminal fines for meeting in their own homes. Now, there again, I want to emphasize, there hasn't been a lot of enforcement on this, but there has been some. Lisa Hansen in Albert Lea is one of those. She has seen a massive amount of enforcement against her. Now, some people would argue, well, she violated the governor's law. Well, first of all, I don't know that they're valid. I think that remains to be seen. The governor has already lost some court cases. He had his hind ends spanked by the courts for his overreach into the churches. And I think that's just one domino in a long series of dominoes that we're going to see fall. Now, there are people out there going, "Oh, TC, you got to stop. Be careful. Be careful what you're saying. You're treading on thin ice." At this point, I don't care. I do not care, because what we have also seen in the interim is that when George Floyd died on May 25th of 2020, we lost control of our state. We, the people, haven't had control of the state for a very long time. But we lost control of the state when George Floyd died. And why do I say that? We saw police hogtied in the state of Minnesota. Every decision that they were made was filtered through the critical race theory lens, through the lens of white supremacy, through the lens of white fragility, through the lens of implicit bias, through the lens of white privilege. Every single law enforcement decision has been criticized or looked through all of those filters, stacked one on top of each other, right? The crime rate in the Twin Cities, but especially in Minneapolis, has skyrocketed. It has become a hellhole. Our governor can't, and I don't care what anybody says, people are like, well, it's not the governor's job to control crime in Minneapolis. Well, wait a minute. It's also not the governor's job to control what I do with my daily life. It's not the governor's job to require me to wear a facial covering. It's not the governor's job to require me to not leave my house unless it's for emergency activities or to go to work. It's also not the governor's job to tell me that whether or not my children have to wear facial coverings. It's not the governor's job to tell me I can't have more than 10 people in my house. So many people are defending Governor Walz and saying, well, it's not his responsibility to control crime in the Twin Cities, especially in Minneapolis. It's not his job. It's not his job. The governor's job as a chief executive elected servant in the state of Minnesota is to protect us from actual threats, not from the COOF. It's not his job to incentivize the COOF jab. It's not his job to give us all sorts of prizes if we are good little sheep and do our patriotic duty. It's his job to protect us from criminal threat. It's his job to protect the state of Minnesota and not turn it into the state of Marxisota, which he has done. It's not his job to protect me from a virus. It's his job to protect innocent lives and innocent citizens in Minneapolis when the Minneapolis City Council and the mayor of Minneapolis sit there and argue over whether or not they're going to dismantle their police department. So what does TC out here in Rocks and Cows, Minnesota have to do with Minneapolis? I have friends that live in the Twin Cities. I have several friends that work in Minneapolis. And they will tell you it's a terrifying ordeal to even leave their offices because they don't know if they're going to be mugged, shot, raped, killed, carjacked, whatever it is, because the police have no control over Minneapolis right now. And it's not because the rank and file law enforcement officers aren't trying to do their job. It's because their hands are tied, not to mention the fact that they're bleeding out as a force. They're literally bleeding out. I happen to know several people who work in counseling law enforcement officers in that area, and they're telling me right now that the cases of PTSD and whatnot are on the rise because they're constantly under stress, not just from armed criminal thugs, but from the perception that every decision that they make is based on the fact that they're evil, that they're Nazis, that they're KKK, whatever. And our governor is sitting on his butt. He's not doing anything. And as the Republican legislature, House and the Senate, call on him to do something, he mocks the idea of sending in the state patrol. Look, if Minneapolis will not protect its citizens, it's the responsibility of the governor at some point to step in and say enough is enough. Because ultimately this affects the taxpayers. You look at the riotous, calamitous, thuggish behavior that happened all summer, especially immediately after George Floyd died. And now Minneapolis is demanding that the state help rebuild Minneapolis. The parts of Minneapolis that burned down, but they won't even control their streets. I mean, they cleared the George Floyd Square the other day and they opened it back up, and within hours it was shut back down by criminal thugs again. Where's the leadership? Where is the leadership in this? The leadership is not interested in fixing this because it doesn't fit the narrative. If they involve themselves in this and they do what they're supposed to do, they're going to look like what they're afraid people think of them. And they're okay throwing rank and file law enforcement under the bus and saying, oh, well, it's just all this implicit bias and white privilege and white supremacy all exists within the law enforcement community. And we need to do something to reform the law enforcement world because we got to get all these racist thugs out of law enforcement. They've forwarded and advanced that agenda so much and that narrative so much that now where the rubber meets the road and they need to come in and do something, they can't. And now they have to make excuses as to why. So what are we going to do? We're going to watch a video that Alpha News shared from the governor's little coof jab incentive promotional trip out to the Minneapolis airport, where if you fly into Minneapolis, you can get a free coof jab. Who's paying for that? Because nothing's free, by the way, Gov. Taxpayers are paying for that. The state's not paying for that. The taxpayers are paying for that, and they're paying for it through the confiscatory tax laws in Minnesota. Ooh, I know. I'm telling the truth about how taxes work. Can't do that in Minnesota either. Can't talk about how taxes really work in Minnesota. And you can't point out that nothing's free, that the taxpayers ultimately pay for it. So now I am going to, as a taxpayer, I get to now fund the Minneapolis airport, setting up pop-up coof jab booths so that people flying into Minnesota can get it for free. What the actual French toast are you talking about? Why? But we're gonna listen to this question from the media to Governor Walz here.
Yeah, the issue of post-pandemic crime and violent crime is not acceptable anywhere. The numbers are pretty typical across the United States. Here in Minnesota, unfortunately, we're seeing it both from Minneapolis to St. Cloud and elsewhere.
This person asked about bringing in outside metro law enforcement. And this is the governor's response.
And it's a complex issue that it involves a lot of different agencies. We are certainly working with those agencies when they request, working with community activist groups. We know
working with community activist groups. I read community organizers, which is nothing more ultimately than Saul Alinsky style community action. Now remember, Saul Alinsky, if you watch my series on Saul Alinsky, it's not done yet, but if you watch it, I talk in one of those that he is called the father of community organization. Community organization ultimately is Marxist based. So why are we working with Marxist based organizations? They're the ones that are giving us the freaking crime in Minneapolis and St. Paul, in every major metro area in the United States, frankly.
Know that there's a lot of faith-based leadership that's out there on the streets. And I think a state streets initiative is something that we've been talking about and working on. I want to be clear.
I love the idea of faith-based initiatives where especially where Christians go out and they bring the gospel to shed the light of Christian thought and Christian morality onto criminals, because ultimately the only way any of these people are going to stop what they're doing is that they're either locked away for the rest of their lives, and I don't want that. I don't want to see anybody have to be in prison for the rest of their lives. When they commit a crime that deserves it, yes. But that's not my goal. But we cannot rely, excuse me, we cannot rely on faith-based organizations to be the ones out there policing our streets. We can't. Like, they're not equipped for that. There's a time and a place for them to do that, but we can't do anything about that.
Clear. Moving the state patrol is a simplistic answer to a more complex problem. It also creates other problems. Traffic deaths on our state's highways are up to a high again. People started speeding after the pandemic.
I'm sorry, literally, and ultimately, I'm sorry that people are dying on our highways. What does after the pandemic, by the way, those are his words, after the pandemic. So if it's after the pandemic, why are we still pushing the coof jab stuff, by the way? And why are you still wearing your facial covering, Governor, if it's after, especially if you've been vaccinated, Gov? But what does the end of the pandemic have to do with people speeding? Like, because somehow prior, like, that's literally what he said. People are speeding more now after the pandemic. And then he adds, well, more people are driving. There might be more people out driving who have now tried to go back to some sense of normalcy in their lives. But the speeding didn't get worse because the pandemic is over. What on earth are you talking about? That's literally one of the most moronic things I've ever heard anybody say. This is a giant word salad of obfuscation and dodging I have ever seen. He's literally dodging the question and trying to blame everything under the sun, but what's to blame here?
There's more folks out there, and for whatever reason, so simply shifting state patrol officers from Duluth to Minneapolis without a coordinated plan, and these jurisdictions, these local jurisdictions, whether it be City of Minneapolis, Hennepin County, Plymouth, Bloomington, St. Cloud, Mankato, they all have organizations where they work together in task force, especially around violent crimes, making sure you're gathering the best data. So
it's not working, Governor. It's not working. Something has got to change, or Minneapolis is going to look like Detroit. That's the simple fact of the matter. Minneapolis is going to end up looking like Detroit. And you are sitting back on your rear end, Tyrant Timmy, and you're allowing the people's state of Marxisota to burn in its metro areas. You know, the areas that you were so worried about when you said, well, that's just rocks and cows country out there.
We certainly agree that there's work to be done, but the idea, once again, of just throwing the state patrol, or worse yet, a non-policing agency like the National Guard doesn't really get at the heart of this. And then I want to make note, we got to continue to work upstream to understand where are the guns getting onto the streets, where are the gang activity starting, how do we interrupt that and divert that, and how are we providing economic opportunities to make sure people don't end up there. So
economic opportunities are not going to stop criminal thugs from being criminal thugs. Do you understand that? There are jobs to be had. They're choosing not to take jobs because it's more lucrative to be a criminal for them. I'm so sick and tired of this false narrative that the poor people don't have a choice but to commit crime. It's racist. Do you understand? It's absolutely 100% foundationally, fundamentally an example of what white supremacy looks like when you have a DFL Marxist governor sit here and say, and this is what he's saying, these poor black people can't help but commit crime because they're poor black people. Because the preponderance of the crime escalation in the Twin Cities is happening in poor black communities. And it's got nothing to do with the fact that they're black. It has everything to do with the fact that we have driven law enforcement out of the network. We have made it impossible in the state of Marxisota for law enforcement in the urban areas to do their jobs, which is to help protect the innocent black folk in poor areas. And there's a man out there, Reverend Tim, begging, absolutely begging for law enforcement to come in and do the jobs that they're trained and hired to do better than anybody else can do it. And they're hand-tied, they're hog-tied, they're not allowing them to do it. That's racist. And when your governor refuses to acknowledge it and wants to blame economic conditions and poverty in these communities, instead of addressing the criminal content of their character, that's racism. Because it's lumping all minority people of color into one ubiquitous collective. Poor black folk commit crime because they're poor black folk and they can't help it. BS.
There's work to be done. It is a serious concern. I think the issue will be certainly a federal partner in this too at some point. And all of those things have to be coordinated around a cohesive plan. Listening to the communities, listening to the experts in this, because the public safety experts are not calling for just a increase in state patrol in Minneapolis. They're calling for a more comprehensive plan, which we'll work with them on.
He could legislate as a governor. He could declare a public emergency, a peacetime public emergency for a virus that has a better than 99% survival rate across the board in the United States, but even here in the state of Minnesota. He could threaten to lock people up. And granted, I know not a lot of people were, some were, but he could threaten to lock a lot of people up. He could threaten to do a lot of things to people for violating his COOF restrictions, but he can't do anything. He can't declare a peacetime public emergency for the crime escalation that's happening. That's why this is all fabricated. It's bogus. It's bogus. You want to know who the real racists in the state of Minnesota are? It's the pandering white leftist Marxist politicians like Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Peggy, is it Flanagan, and people like the Marxist race baiting Attorney General Keith Ellison. They're the racists. They spend all of their time when it comes to crime and it comes to law enforcement, calling law enforcement officers, even people of color in law enforcement, implying that they're all racist and that they target people of color in disproportionate amounts. They fan the flames every time there's a law enforcement involved shooting. Some of them are bad shootings. Some of them are good. Every time there's something like this, they fan the flames of racism. They fan the flames of white privilege and white supremacy and white racism and all of that. But when it comes time to put their money where their mouth is, they can't give you a direct answer about what they're going to do because they don't want to do anything about it. They don't care. If they can keep those poor people in Minneapolis, especially the poorer communities, especially those communities where poverty is a reality, if they can keep them poor, they can keep them dependent on the system, and they can keep them voting for the people who promise to give them the most. And when are we going to, as a collective group of individualists, going to rise up and say, stop promising to give people everything so that they can live and survive, and show them how to survive on their own? Allow them to become entrepreneurs in a safe environment where they don't have to worry about their businesses being burned down by people who are pissed off because some narrative said that something happened to someone somewhere. Remember Ilhan Omar's words? Some people did something to some people somewhere. September 11th, 2001. The real racists are the Marxist leftists in the DFL and leadership in the DFL and men like Governor Walz. Because they don't give a damn about the people in those communities who are being gunned down. Minority children, especially. Not a word. We need to get, excuse the terminology, bastards like this out of office. He needs to go. As always, until next time, my friends and my fellow patriots, don't worry about your safety. Fight for your liberty and your freedom, and especially Sic Semper Tyrannis.